Hi there. Welcome to this online lecture where we're going to be looking at identifying and analysing mixed costs. I'm Gareth. I'm a tutor and director with First Intuition, one of the UK's premier accountancy training colleges. More than welcome to get in touch with me. I help run our AAT distance learning programme and I'm involved in classroom courses in different centres in the UK. My email address is garethjohn@fi.co.uk. You can also quite often find me on social media. You might come across me on Facebook, for instance, or Twitter. You can follow me on Twitter at @AATTopTutor. Over the last few years, First Intuition, we've been extremely proud to win College of the Year in 3 out of 5 years, first college to ever do so. I was extremely proud to be awarded UK Accountancy Lecturer of the Year back in 2011 based on student nominations. We're also nominated for Study Resource of the Year in 2013. So I'm very, very proud of the kind of feedback that we've been getting from our students. Well, in this online lecture, we're going to be looking at how to identify and deal with mixed costs. Mixed costs, also sometimes called semi-variable costs, where literally you have a mix of a fixed element and a variable element, and it's useful to be able to split those out, particularly maybe for budgeting in the future. Well, let's have a look at the example we're dealing with. So over the last 3 months, a business has recorded production volumes and total costs as shown here. Now, let's start by looking at what kind of cost we're dealing with. What behaviour does this cost exhibit? And I can almost go through a process of elimination here. Well, firstly, and probably most simply, is this a fixed cost? Now, a fixed cost is where the cost is not affected by changes in volume. So even if you produce more units, the cost would stay the same. Is this a fixed cost? Well, clearly not, because it has changed. So I can identify it's not a fixed cost. Is it, on the other hand, a variable cost? Now, this is sometimes harder to identify because with a variable cost, if the volume changes, the cost will change. Now, you can see here that from month 1 to month 2, the volume has increased from 500 to 600 units. And actually, the cost has gone up as well. Does that mean that this is a variable cost? Well, the problem I have is this could be a variable cost because that would increase as volume increases, but it could also be a mixed cost because since mixed costs have a variable element, they also increase as volumes increase. So how can I identify whether this is a variable cost or a mixed cost? Well, the easiest way to do this is to actually work out the cost per unit at each level of production. So basically the cost per unit for each of my 3 months here. So all I'm looking to do is take the cost figure for the month, divide by the number of units that were produced. So in the first month, £1,400 divided by 500 units translates to £2.80 per unit. Well, what about month 2, where the cost, now that had risen to £1,600, but the volume's risen to 600 units. Now, if you do 1,600 over 600, well, it gives me a different figure, 2.67, if I round that to 2 decimal places. And then in month 3, well, actually you can see we've got the lowest cost overall, £1,300, because we've got the lowest volume. So divide by 450 units gives me now 2.89 if I round to 2 decimal places. Now, what I'm looking for is how that cost per unit is behaving. The fact that the cost per unit is changing actually implies this is a mixed cost. If that cost per unit figure had stayed the same at all levels of output, so if it had been £2.80 each time I worked it out, that would indicate it was a variable cost. So the fact that the cost per unit has changed means that I'm dealing with a mixed cost because part of the cost is therefore fixed. Well, how do we deal with a mixed cost if we want to break it down between its variable and its fixed elements? Well, we use the so-called high-low method. Now, the high-low method is called the high-low method because we take the highest pair of data, which I reckon here is month 2, where we had the highest number of units and correspondingly the highest cost, and we take the lowest pair of data, which I think is month 3, lowest volume and lowest cost. So actually we're effectively going to ignore the middle month, month 1. Month 1 was the middle in terms of both volume and cost. We're going to ignore that and just use the highest and the lowest figures. Well, first step of the high-low method is to look at the high and low figures for both volume and cost. So, the high volume figure, which was for month 2, was 600 units, and the low volume figure, which for month 3 was 450 units, and work out the difference. Now the difference between 600 units and 450 units is 150 units, and we can do the same for the cost. So the high cost was £1,600 and the low cost is £1,300. And again, what's the difference? Well, the difference between 1,600 and 1,300 is £300. So what we're saying is that for an increase of 150 units, the cost has gone up by £300. And this allows us to do the second step, which is to work out what the variable cost per unit is. Well, if 150 units led to an increase of cost of £300, you can see each unit is costing you more than £1. So if you divide the difference in cost over the difference in the volume, and make sure you do it that way around, so it's the difference in cost over the difference in volume, that'll tell you what the cost of each individual unit is. And £300 over 150 units is £2 per unit as the variable cost. So when you're doing the high-low method, the first thing you're going to identify is what the variable cost per unit is. In fact, that information is then going to be useful for deriving the fixed cost. So because we now know the variable cost per unit, we can start identifying what the fixed cost is by using our knowledge of what a mixed cost is made up of. With a mixed cost, the total cost is literally a mix of a fixed cost element and a variable cost element. That's why it's called a mixed cost. Well, bear in mind sometimes it's referred to as a semi-variable cost. Now, fixed costs are unaffected by the volume of production. So the fixed cost will be the same figure regardless of how many units are being produced, but the variable cost will vary. So in fact we can actually extend out the concept of the variable cost to say that in total that will be the variable cost per unit times the quantity. So this is well worth learning, little expression for a mixed cost. Now if we apply that to one of the two pairs of data we've got, I'm going to go with the high pair. You can see the high pair has a cost of £1,600 for a volume of 600 units. So if I put in that total cost, so 1,600 is the total cost, we know that has a fixed and a variable element. We don't know what the fixed cost is yet. That's what we're trying to identify. But we can now identify what the variable cost must be, because we've just worked out that the variable cost per unit is £2. And at the high pair of data, we'll be suffering that £2 per unit for each of those 600 units. Now we can therefore work out, well, £2 per unit times 600 units is a total of £1,200 for the total of what the variable cost would be at that level of production. And if the total cost is 1,600, and we know the variable bit is 1,200, well, the fixed cost must be the difference, which I'm thinking here is £400 as the total fixed cost, which would be suffered regardless of how many units we're producing. So I've now broken down the mixed cost. I know it's £2 per unit for variable cost and £400 for the fixed cost. Now the high-low technique, very common approach in management accounting to splitting mixed costs, because actually quite a lot of costs that businesses suffer will actually be mixed in nature. So high-low can be a very effective technique for helping us split that down. For instance, for allowing us to do budgeting for the future, because when you budget you need to identify whether costs are variable or fixed. It can help with things like break-even analysis. You might be aware that with break-even analysis you need to know which bits of the costs are fixed and which are variable. It's a very useful technique which you'll actually see several times through the different stages of your AAT studies. Well, I hope that has made a bit of sense. Thank you very much for your attention, and I'll see you next time.